The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as Anna adjusted her scrubs and glanced at the clock. 2:45 a.m. The hospital was unusually quiet tonight, the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. She worked the night shift for years, but something about this evening felt different. As she passed the waiting area, she saw him. A man sat slouched in one of the faded orange chairs, his head tilted slightly as he stared blankly at the wall. His thin frame was silhouetted by the dim emergency lighting, and his clothes an old flannel shirt and jeans seemed out of place for someone waiting in the hospital. "Can I help you?" Anna called out, stepping closer. Her voice echoed faintly in the stillness. The man didn't respond or even flinch. He just sat there, unblinking. Anna's stomach churned uneasily as she approached. "Sir?" She tried again, gentler this time. But when she turned the corner into the row of chairs, the man was gone. Her breath hitched. The chair where he had been sitting was empty, and the air around it felt unnervingly cold. Anna shook her head and muttered, "Maybe I'm just tired." With a glance over her shoulder, she walked back to the nurse's station, chalking it up to her imagination. The next night, as the clock crept toward 3 a.m., Anna's heart sank when she passed the waiting room again. There he was, in the same chair, wearing the same clothes, staring at the wall like before. This time, she froze. She rubbed her eyes, certain she was imagining things, but when she looked again, he was still there. Anna forced herself to move forward, her footsteps heavy against the polished linoleum floor. "Sir, are you waiting for someone?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. This time, as she reached out a hand, he flickered like a bad signal on an old TV. One blink and he was gone. Anna's pulse raced. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the room for any sign of him. But there was nothing. The silence pressed down on her, almost deafening. "Hey, you okay?" A voice startled her. It was Sarah, the ER receptionist, standing in the doorway. Anna jumped, her hand flying to her chest. "I thought I saw someone," Anna stammered. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What in here? You're seeing ghosts now." Anna forced a laugh and waved her off. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah might not be wrong. By the third night, Anna couldn't suppress her curiosity. She mentioned the strange man to one of her co-workers, an older nurse named Ruth, who had been at the hospital for decades. Ruth's face went pale. "You're seeing him, too?" she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Wait, what do you mean, too?" Anna demanded. Ruth hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Years ago, there was a patient. He came in late one night sick as a dog but refused treatment. He just sat there, waiting. Eventually, he collapsed in the hallway and didn't make it." Ruth's voice dropped to a whisper. "People say his spirit still wanders the hospital, always sitting in that same chair." Anna's mouth went dry. "That's just a story, right?" Ruth didn't answer. Instead, she pushed a folder toward Anna. "Check the security footage if you don't believe me." When Anna finally worked up the nerve to review the footage, her heart pounded in her chest. She fast-forwarded through hours of empty hallways until she spotted herself walking into the waiting room. There was no one else there. No man in the chair. No shadow. Nothing. But then, her heart nearly stopped. The footage showed her talking animatedly at an empty seat. And as she leaned closer to where the man should have been, a faint, shadowy figure flickered into view on the screen for just a split second before vanishing again. Anna pushed back from the desk, her hands trembling. The air in the revelation from the security footage haunted Anna for days. She'd never been one to believe in the supernatural, but now she couldn't deny what she had seen. The shadowy figure, flickering like an old photograph trying to come to life. Felt too real to be a glitch. It was 2:50 a.m. again. Anna sat at the nurse's station, her hands clenched around her coffee cup. The quiet hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of footsteps from distant hallways were her only company. She couldn't bring herself to pass the waiting area yet. She didn't want to see him. Not tonight. But her heart sank when she heard a low, rhythmic creaking. It came from down the hall, toward the waiting area. Slowly, reluctantly, Anna stood. The sound was unmistakable, the ancient metal frame of a chair shifting under weight. Her footsteps felt heavy as she approached the waiting area. The overhead light flickered once, casting jagged shadows that danced along the walls. When she rounded the corner, her stomach flipped. There he was. The man sat in the chair, his gaunt face illuminated by the dim glow of an exit sign. But this time, his head was tilted toward her. He wasn't staring blankly at the wall anymore. He was looking directly at her. Anna froze. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The man's eyes, dark and hollow, bore into hers as though they could see through her. For the first time, he moved. Slowly, almost mechanically, he raised one skeletal hand and pointed toward the hallway. What do you want?" Anna stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't respond. His mouth remained shut, lips thin and bloodless. He pointed again, more insistently this time, his arm jerking like a broken marionette. Anna's feet moved before her mind caught up. She stumbled down the hallway he'd indicated, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She didn't dare look back, terrified of what she might see. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of her, its pale walls narrowing with each step. Then she saw it. Room 313. The door stood ajar, a faint glow spilling into the hall. Anna hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't. Something compelled her forward, as though invisible hands were pushing her. Inside the room, the faint smell of antiseptic and something far more unpleasant, a faint metallic tang filled the air. The hospital bed was empty, the sheets pulled tight and pristine. A wheelchair sat in the corner, its wheels slightly askew. On the floor beneath the bed, a trail of dark smudges led to the far wall. Anna crouched down, her shaking hand reaching for the smudges. They were reddish-brown, long-dried. Blood. Her stomach churned. A sudden rush of cold air swept through the room, and Anna gasped as the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, pressing her back to the wall. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she scanned the room, but there was no one there. No one, except a reflection. In the small window of the closed door, she saw the man again. He stood just behind her, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, his hollow eyes locked onto hers. Anna whipped around, but the room was empty. "Help him." The voice was low, rasping, as though it came from everywhere at once. Anna's heart stopped. She couldn't tell if the voice was real or in her head, but she nodded frantically. "Help who?" she whispered. "Tell me what to do." But there was no answer. The room fell silent again, save for the faint whir of air through the vents. The sense of presence, the oppressive weight in the air lifted, leaving Anna shaking and alone. The next day, Anna couldn't rest until she found out who had stayed in room 313. She searched through patient records, her fingers trembling as she clicked through files. Then she found it. The man in the waiting room had been a patient. His name was William Harker, a transit with no known family. He had come in complaining of chest pain, but left against medical advice. 2 days later, his body was found in the woods near the hospital. The file contained a single note scrawled in the margin. Last seen in waiting area, approximate 3 a.m. That night, Anna returned to work, her nerves frayed and her thoughts racing. At 2:50 a.m., she walked toward the waiting area again. The chair was empty this time, but the air still felt wrong, too heavy, too cold. She knelt by the chair where the man had always sat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know how to help you." The lights flickered, and the faint sound of a breath so close it made her skin crawl brushed past her ear. "You already did," the rasping voice murmured. When Anna looked up, the chair was empty. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive cold was gone. For the first time in 3 nights, the waiting area was truly empty. Anna stood and walked away, feeling the man's presence lift like a shadow finally retreating into the darkness. The second story. The fog was thick, an oppressive shroud draped over the lonely highway. My wipers swished in a hypnotic rhythm, clearing just enough of the windshield to glimpse the road ahead. It was nearly midnight, and I was exhausted, the kind of tired where your thoughts begin to feel sluggish and surreal. My playlist had looped for the 3rd time, and my coffee cup was long since empty. That's when I saw him. He was standing by the shoulder, his thumb sticking out, silhouetted against the faint beam of my headlights. The fog distorted everything, but he looked ordinary. Just a guy, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, wearing a dark jacket and a knit cap. It was freezing out there, and he had no bag, no visible signs of where he might have come from. Against every self-preservation instinct I had, I slowed down and rolled the passenger window down a crack. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He stepped closer, his face becoming clearer through the fog. He had a kind face, but his eyes, they were pale, almost too pale, and they reflected the light oddly. "Yeah," he said quietly, "just a few miles up the road." I nodded, leaning over to unlock the door. "Hop in." The stranger slid into the seat and shut the door with a soft thud. He smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic, but I couldn't place it. For the first few minutes, we drove in silence. He stared straight ahead, hands clasped in his lap, and I started to regret my decision. My pulse thrummed in my ears, louder than the hum of the engine. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the tension. He turned to me then, his expression unreadable. "Not far," he said. "You're heading home, right?" The question caught me off guard. "Yeah," I said slowly. "You from around here?" "No," he replied, turning back to the windshield. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "But you are." Something about the way he said it sent a chill skittering down my spine. "How do you know that?" I asked, keeping my tone light. He smiled faintly but didn't answer. The road ahead stretched on, the fog swallowing everything beyond the range of my headlights. My grip on the wheel tightened. "I used to love driving at night," he said suddenly. "The quiet, the emptiness. Feels like you've got the whole world to yourself." "Yeah," I said, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. "It's peaceful." "But it's not peaceful tonight," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Not with the things that are out there." My breath hitched. "What things?" He turned to face me fully now, and his pale eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the dashboard. "You know," he said almost casually, "the things that follow." "What are you talking about?" He smiled wider now, but there was no warmth in it. "The shadows. They were waiting by your car." My hands were trembling, but I kept my eyes fixed on the road. "You're messing with me." "Am I?" he murmured, leaning back in his seat. "Tell me, did you see anyone else at the gas station?" I racked my brain, trying to recall. It had been nearly empty, just a bored-looking attendant and a couple of parked trucks. No one unusual. "I don't know," I said defensively. "Why does it matter?" He didn't respond immediately, just watched me, his gaze unwavering. "You should have locked the car," he said finally. "But it's too late now." I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded slightly on the slick asphalt, the tires screeching in protest. My heart was pounding in my chest as I turned to confront him, but the passenger seat was empty. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the car frantically. The door was still locked, and the seatbelt hung limp at his side. The man was gone. The fog outside pressed against the car windows, wrapping the world in a suffocating silence. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at the empty passenger seat. One moment he'd been there, his pale eyes boring into mine, and the next nothing. No sound, no movement, just gone. I scrambled for my phone, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. Maybe I could call anyone, to talk me through this. But as the screen lit up, it reflected something in the rearview mirror, a fleeting, dark shape darting behind the car. I twisted around, but the back seat was empty. The world outside the car was still as death, and the only sound was my ragged breathing. "Get it together," I whispered to myself, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "You're just tired." I shifted the car back into gear and pressed the gas. The engine whined, and the tires spun for a moment before catching the pavement. The headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the endless road ahead. But then the radio crackled to life. I nearly jumped out of my skin as static hissed through the speakers. I hadn't touched the dial since I started driving, but now faint whispers bled through the white noise, fragmented and distorted. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded familiar, like my own voice, echoing back at me in fragments of things I'd said earlier that day. With a shaking hand, I turned the volume down, but the static persisted, faint but constant. That's when I saw it, something moving in the fog, just ahead. My headlights caught the faint outline of a figure walking down the middle of the road. My stomach clenched as I recognized the knit cap and dark jacket. It was him, the hitchhiker. I slammed on the brakes again, my car skidding to a halt just feet from where he stood. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, motionless, his back to me. My instincts screamed at me to floor it and get the hell out of there. But something stronger, a sick, morbid curiosity, made me roll the window down instead. "Hey!" I shouted. My voice sounded too loud, too desperate in the stillness. "What do you want?" He turned slowly, his movements unnatural, almost jerky, like a marionette being controlled by an unseen puppeteer. His face was pale and drawn, and his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I told you," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "You should have locked the car." The air in the car turned icy cold, my breath fogging up in front of me. I fumbled for the door lock button, slamming it down with shaking fingers. But when I glanced up, he was gone again. No footprints, no sign that he'd ever been there. I couldn't take it anymore. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the car tore down the highway. The fog seemed to thicken, the shadows on the road twisting and writhing like living things. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my fingers ached, and I barely noticed the tears streaming down my face. Finally, a neon sign broke through the haze. A gas station. I pulled in and parked haphazardly near the entrance, throwing the car into park and stumbling out. The harsh fluorescent lights of the station were a welcome relief, breaking through the oppressive darkness. The cashier behind the counter, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, looked up as I burst in, out of breath and wild-eyed. "You okay there?" he asked, his voice slow and calm, like I was some skittish animal he didn't want to startle. I nodded, trying to collect myself. Did anyone else come through here?" I asked, my voice shaky. A guy in a knit cap, dark jacket? The cashier frowned, scratching his beard. Nope, he said. You're the first customer I've seen in hours. I sank onto a stool by the counter, my legs too weak to hold me up. My gaze wandered to a corkboard on the wall near the register. It was covered with faded flyers missing pets, garage sale notices, and a few black and white photos of missing persons. My blood ran cold when my eyes landed on one of them. It was him, the hitchhiker, the same pale eyes, the same knit cap. The banner above the board read, "Missing Persons." That one, I whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. Who is that? The cashier followed my gaze, then sighed. Oh, him. That's Danny Caldwell. Went missing about 5 years ago. They never found the body. My throat went dry. What happened to him? The cashier shrugged. Car broke down on this highway late at night. They say he started walking to find help but never made it. People around here think his spirit still roams the road, looking for a ride. I stumbled back toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The cashier's voice followed me as I stepped out into the cold night air. Hey, he called after me. If you see him again, don't pick him up. I didn't respond. I just climbed back into my car and drove off, the gas station disappearing into the fog behind me. The third story. It started as a fleeting oddity, a man she didn't recognize, hovering at the periphery of her vision. Samantha spotted him first at the grocery store, a wiry figure in a navy hoodie, his face obscured beneath the fluorescent lights. He stood too still in the produce aisle, his eyes not on the apples he was pretending to examine, but on her. She brushed it off. Maybe she'd overanalyzed his gaze. After all, people looked at each other in public spaces all the time, right? But then she saw him again the next day at her favorite coffee shop. This time, he sat by the window, sipping an untouched cup of something dark. He wasn't subtle. When she glanced in his direction, his head whipped to the side, as though the street outside suddenly held his interest. Her stomach twisted, but Samantha still told herself it was just coincidence. The city wasn't small, but it wasn't sprawling either. The third time, however, was harder to ignore. As she exited her office late one evening, there he was leaning casually against a lamppost outside the building. His stance was relaxed, hands in his pockets, but his eyes betrayed him. They followed her every step toward her car. Her pulse quickened. Could he just be passing by? That night, her unease festered. She double-checked her door locks and left every light in her apartment blazing. Even so, sleep eluded her. Every creak of the old building felt like a whisper of something sinister creeping closer. The photos came 2 days later. She found them on her windshield, carefully taped, as though placed with a twisted reverence. At first, she thought it was some annoying parking ticket. But no, the images were all of her, from different places, different days. Her walking into the grocery store, sipping coffee. The angle suggested a long lens. A careful hand. She scanned the parking lot, her heart hammering. But there was no one. The cars were still. The trees swayed lazily in the wind, oblivious to her terror. She rushed to the police, her hands trembling as she handed over the photos. The officer on duty offered a tight-lipped nod and a clipboard. We'll file this, but without a known suspect or direct threat, there's not much we can do. Have you noticed anyone following you? Yes. She told them about the man in the hoodie, the coffee shop, and outside her office. They took down her statement, promised to increase patrols in her neighborhood. But Samantha could see it in their eyes this wasn't a priority. Just be vigilant, ma'am, they said. Weeks passed. The man seemed to vanish, and the photos stopped. She began to think maybe, just maybe, Her life was returning to normal. Then one evening, while reaching for a book on her shelf, she noticed something strange. A tiny black speck wedged between two spines. She pulled out a small, square device with a blinking red light, a hidden camera. Panic surged like a tidal wave. She tore apart her apartment, her fingers trembling as she searched. Under the coffee table, behind picture frames, even inside her bedroom lamp. She found 4 more cameras, each carefully hidden, their blinking lights mocking her. Who could have done this? How long had they been watching? The answer came the following day, in the form of a smiling face. Her new landlord had scheduled a routine inspection, a formality he'd said when she moved in 2 months ago. She opened the door, and there he was. Navy hoodie, wiry frame, the same man who had haunted her daily life. Only now, his smile stretched too wide, his handshake lingered too long. "Ms. Harper," he said, his voice smooth but his eyes cold. "I just need to check the wiring." Her world tilted. She couldn't breathe. He knew her name, her space, her vulnerabilities. Her sanctuary had become her prison. Samantha's heart pounded as she stepped aside, letting him into her apartment. She plastered on a fake smile, pretending she didn't recognize him, pretending her skin wasn't crawling. He walked in like he owned the place, which, in a way, he did. "Shouldn't take more than 10 minutes, he said, glancing around. His eyes lingered a beat too long on her bedroom door. Just routine stuff. She stood rooted by the door, her mind racing. Does he know I found the cameras? What happens if he does? Samantha didn't dare confront him. Not yet. Instead, she pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling as she texted her friend Clara. "Call me now. Emergency." The phone rang within seconds. Samantha answered on speaker. "Hey, Clara," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Oh, you're coming by? Great. I'll see you in 10. The man's head snapped toward her, his expression tightening for the briefest moment. It was subtle, but she saw it, a flicker of irritation. "I'll be quick," he said, disappearing into the bedroom. Samantha followed cautiously, keeping her distance. She leaned against the wall, pretending to check her phone while watching his every move. He crouched near an outlet, his back to her, but she could see his hands trembling. Why was he nervous? Wasn't he in control? "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice betraying none of her terror. "Oh, yes," he replied too quickly. "Just outdated wiring. Happens in these older buildings." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her phone vibrated, a message from Clara. "Calling the cops. Stay calm. Stall him." Minutes stretched like hours, but the man finally stood and dusted off his hands. He flashed her a tight-lipped smile. "All done here. You have my number if anything else comes up." She watched him leave, her legs weak with relief. But the moment the door clicked shut, panic took over. She checked every lock, every window. Her sanctuary wasn't just compromised. It was a playground for someone who enjoyed watching her squirm. The police arrived shortly after. Clara showed up with them, her face pale with worry. The officers swept the apartment, confirming what she already knew. The cameras were real, and whoever had installed them had been monitoring her for weeks. They took her statement again, promising to look into the landlord. When they left, Samantha felt a little safer. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe, but the feeling didn't last. That night, the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost polite. A single knock, then silence. Samantha froze, her breath hitching. She turned off all the lights, grabbed her phone, and crept toward the peephole. No one was there. She backed away, clutching her phone like a lifeline, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Then, another knock, louder this time, insistent. Her heart pounded as she checked the peephole again. Empty. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. A new text from an unknown number. "I see you." She dropped the phone, the screen cracking as it hit the floor. The power cut out. Darkness swallowed her apartment, and the silence was deafening. Samantha stumbled to the kitchen, her trembling hands searching for the drawer where she kept a flashlight. She found it and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the shadows. The knocking resumed, but it wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was behind her inside the apartment. Samantha spun around, the flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the room. The sound stopped. Then, from the corner of the living room, a low, mocking chuckle emerged. Her blood turned to ice as the landlord stepped into the light, his face eerily calm. "I told you to call me if you needed anything," he said, his voice dripping with menace. Her scream caught in her throat as he lunged forward, knocking the flashlight from her hands. They struggled in the darkness, her hands flailing for anything to defend herself. Her fingers brushed against the heavy base of a lamp, and she swung blindly, connecting with his shoulder. He grunted in pain, giving her just enough time to run. Samantha bolted out the door, her bare feet slapping against the hallway floor. She didn't stop until she was outside, screaming for help. Lights flicked on in neighboring apartments, and someone called the police. By the time the officers arrived, the landlord was gone. The apartment was empty, save for the cameras they'd missed during their first sweep. One was hidden in her bathroom, another tucked into a vent above her bed. They found no sign of him, no evidence beyond the cameras and her cracked phone. The building management claimed they'd never hired him. His lease application had been fake. He had been watching her for months, his plan meticulous and deliberate. But now he was gone, vanishing like a ghost in the night. Samantha moved out the next day, leaving her belongings behind. She knew she'd never feel safe there again, but as she drove away, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. She couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't over. Somewhere out there, he was still watching, waiting